Hello and welcome to episode 11 of the Music Survival Guide. As always, I'm joined by my co-host Phil.
Good afternoon, morning, evening, whenever you're listening. Hello!
How you doing, mate?
I am alright. I have battled through in the last week a cold and food poisoning, but I'm still standing, yeah. How are you?
I'm alright. Tis the season to be unwell, really, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah, I'm doing good. I've been busy, so can't complain. But yeah, overall, feeling fighting fit. What have you been up to?
I have been on the lookout for various items so I can build a mobile recording rig. If you could insert a sort of ooh noise effect, that would be really good. So actually, genuinely following on from what we were talking about last week, I'm going to take some of that advice myself and buy some of those items. So I'm looking to build like a small little kind of setup so I can take it with me and record bands wherever they happen to be.
Sounds good. So what are we going to talk about today?
Well, this week we are talking about home recording studios and in what ways sort of actually recording your music is sort of different to a demo, and in what ways it's different to being in the studio and things like that.
Yeah, so I think a really good place to start is what is the difference between a home demo or recording demo and a home studio production? Do you want to kind of take off with that? Yeah,
so I guess a demo is primarily there for the band and maybe for a producer if you are going to a quote unquote professional recording studio to really work out the shape of the song and what it's going to do and to just help you kind of hone your ideas really. And as we said in a previous podcast, I want to say it was episode 9, but I can't remember off the top of my head, where we talked about demos. It can be anything from a single microphone or even a phone in a rehearsal studio all the way to a sort of multi-track setup, but you could genuinely release it and it'd sound pretty good.
Yeah, like you said there, the thing I've got written down is demo is for personal reference. So it's not the thing that's going to, be put out to the world. And when I say personal reference, I just kind of mean not for public consumption. So I've seen it in the last week. Bands have sent demos to mix engineers to see if they'd be interested later down the line, producers, to their managers to keep everyone in on a loop. So yeah, I think that's the big difference. Whereas something done in a home studio is something that you're going to put out into the world for the general public to hear.
Yes, fit for public consumption.
Yeah,
for want of a better phrase. So a big kind of question, an obvious question is, why is this worth considering? Why is it worth considering building or creating a sort of home recording setup in comparison to going to a big studio and doing your record? There are many things I could say. There are many great benefits actually to having a home recording studio. So you have time. It's actually probably the biggest one. You have all the time that you want or need to hone your record. So when you're in a big professional studio, the clock is ticking, as they say, and the pressure is somewhat on. And if you get into the studio and you get nervous, then that is essentially money down the drain, for want of a better phrase. But if you're in the home studio, if you're in your house or your bandmate's house, then you have as much time as you need to get the emotion and the feeling into your recording.
Yeah, there's something really interesting you picked up there, which is essentially red light syndrome, which is where no matter how practiced you are, you can get in front and just kind of freeze or not be able to play the parts. I apologise if you can hear a dog barking in the background. There's nothing I can do about that.
Woof.
So, and there's also nothing to be ashamed of with that. There are loads of fantastic musicians that I've recorded on multiple occasions, and it can just be something, they've had a bad night's sleep the night before, there's just something slightly putting them off, and they can just freeze up. A good producer or a good engineer, it's part of our job to kind of help you get out of that. But yeah, there's nothing really to stress about red light syndrome. It just happens. The important thing is to kind of just take a breather, take a few seconds, meditate, or do whatever you need to do to get yourself back to zero, and then have another go.
Pretty much exactly that. It's worth saying that there can be some level of, I guess, stigma attached to recording in the home studio. So there may be, there's a fear that if you tell someone that you've recorded it at home instead of in a studio, they'll look down on you and go, "Oh, you're not a real artist, you're not a real band." But I want to tell you, there are chart-topping musicians and bands who record at home nowadays. It's quite an amazing thing, actually. But there's the biggest one that I can think of is Billie Eilish. Eilish? Is that how you say her name?
Eilish.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think it's her brother, and they record
Phineas.
together in Phineas. What a name! And they record together in their home studio, and that is chart topping. So if they can do that, then why can't you?
Yeah, chart topping is an understatement for them. I think
Pretty much.
Bad Guy is on 1 billion streams on Spotify alone.
A lot of streams. That's all I know.
Something ridiculous. Yeah, they've completely blown up, and that was done in the home studio. I think there's something quite interesting to unpack about the stigma towards recording in a home studio. Obviously, recording in a home studio is, in theory, a lot cheaper than recording in a commercial studio. So I don't know if the stigma comes from there's an assumption that home studio stuff is done cheaper, that it's not proper. There may be, associations with the golden age, in inverted commas, of recording. And those were done in commercial studios, so people feel like, you're not doing it the proper way that the legends did it. It's a bit of a myth that you can't do great sounding recordings out of your home recording studio. I think the aim, I know, for a lot of people who do that is they want something that no one can tell has been done in a home recording studio. Is that something you'd agree with?
Yes. They want something that sounds professional. Actually, I think that's probably the watchword, isn't it? That it sounds professional. That you could listen to it, and then you could listen to, I don't know, whatever genre you're in. There's some famous old artist, and it would sound sonically similar. So you wouldn't notice the difference as such. It would sound as good as the records they've actually grown up listening to. That's probably what it comes down to.
Yeah, and especially now in the era of playlists where you're going to get chucked on with all kinds, you kind of want your stuff to match up.
Oh, yes.
To other stuff on the playlist. That's where you can really tell a difference in quality if it's not there.
I think there's a lot of practical considerations to setting up a home recording studio. In terms of the gear to buy and that kind of thing. The last episode is probably a great starting place, so I'll point you to that, back to episode 10. But there's practical considerations. So if you are recording drums, obvious statement, it could get loud. And that can be hard to deal with. So you could be living in a terraced house if you're in the UK, or even a flat, and you have to consider your neighbours, and your neighbours may not be happy with you hitting drums for hours on end. But there are solutions to these things. So don't be discouraged. It may be that you don't have a neighbour problem, for want of a better phrase. So that's not necessarily a problem. Or you could rent out a rehearsal studio or just some kind of space or hall, and you could record yourself in there for the loud bits, for the drums or maybe the guitar amps and things like that. And that is a very practical solution to the problem. So it doesn't necessarily make it impossible.
Even giving yourself a little bit of a plug is you can contact people such as Phil, who will do mobile engineering and recording, rent out a rehearsal space that will be isolated enough, and people like Phil can come along and record you from there, and you'll get professional quality recordings.
Happy days.
Happy days.
Happy days. You're very much better at plugging yourself than me, if I'm really honest. But there we are.
I'm plugging you.
Yay. Thank you. Another consideration, which is actually really important, is room acoustics. So the big difference in my mind between recording at home and recording in a professional studio is not necessarily the thousands of pounds of gear and a really nice recording console and things like that. It's actually the space. A really, really good recording studio, what is good about it is the recording spaces, the ambience of it just sounds good, and it's conducive to music, whatever that may sound like. A different studio sound different. And the noticeable and obvious statement is that a home is designed to be lived in. It's not designed for music recording. You may happen to have an amazing room that just sounds really nice, has a really nice ambience, or it maybe should be a bit small and sound horrific. There's a chance that your only available space is really small and the noise just bounces round and it sounds horrendous. So controlling room acoustics is really key. You don't have to spend a ton of money to control your room acoustics. Just a bit of clever thought. So you have to think about using things like blankets, and in a more extreme case you could use mattresses to just really control the sound and stop things bouncing around. Other things like bookcases can really help kind of diffuse the sound, nice technical term there, and just stop it kind of bouncing around and harming your recording. And it's actually simpler than people realise, I think.
Yeah, I think that's actually a future episode idea, maybe, is how we do guerrilla home recording techniques.
I don't know where would you get a gorilla from?
Anyway. Yeah, there's one thing to be said for that as well, though, is acoustics can be quite a daunting thing. I think there will be a lot of people out there who tell you like, oh well, you need to have like this in place to diffuse this, that, and the other. It's something to consider, but it ultimately shouldn't be something that should put you off entirely from recording. If you feel like, if you haven't got an acoustician in and spent $3,000 on, your recording space in your home, which, like Phil said, your home is designed to be lived in. It's not a recording studio. Don't let that put you off. There's plenty of stuff online. If you go on YouTube, I'm sure you'll find loads and loads of videos on like how to record acoustic guitar in your bedroom, or how to record, a homemade vocal booth and stuff like that. It shouldn't be a factor that prevents you from starting recording.
Yes, I know for a fact those videos are out there. I've actually seen some in thinking about this episode. So there you are. That's where the idea for the mattress came from, actually.
Yeah, so another practical benefit, whilst being on that theme, is time. You get so much more time because ultimately you're not working against a budget. There are obviously things to consider, like when you're doing time of, if you're doing drums, obviously you can't go well into the night and become the bane of your local neighborhood. But if you listen back to the stuff in a week later, or, even on the way back home from the drummer's house where you've recorded things, and you go, that wasn't quite right. Maybe we could do it a bit better. You now have the option of kind of going back and going, oh, okay, yeah, let's try a few more. And the same goes for songs. I think there's a feeling amongst a lot of bands that if you spend money on a commercial studio, you have to put out whatever you record in there because you've spent a large amount of money. Whereas if it's with home studio, you've got I'm trying to think of the best way of phrasing it.
You've got free reign.
Yeah, there's free reign and there's much more editorial control. So you've kind of got time to reflect on stuff. You don't have to go, oh crap, we've only got 2 days to get everything done. We need to kind of do the drums, move on to the bass, whatever. You can do the drums, go away for 2 days, listen to the drums, have a discussion about it, and then come back and potentially redo it or change parts or whatever. Whereas in commercial studios, obviously there's that pressure to just, okay, it's done, move on.
And on a similar vein, you could even, in a more extreme way, record an entire song, decide you fundamentally don't like it. I mean, and I hope you don't, but you may decide, actually, no, this song fundamentally doesn't work for whatever reason. And you've you've spent some time recording it and you put all that down, but you've not spent the amount of money you would have spent in a studio to do that. So you can take it away and work on it again without having felt like you've just wasted all that money.
Yeah, that's also, I think, an important part of being a musician, and is something that having a home recording studio allows you to do, is that in the so-called, heyday or golden age of record making, if you were one of the big bands on a huge label, the songs that you heard that were on the album, there'll also be 90 others that were scrapped. But because they had the budgets to do it, they could, go and write for 6 weeks at a time in professional recording studios and work on loads and loads of songs. Whereas now, if you have a home recording studio, you can do that. I actively encourage bands that I produce, that I say, okay, if we want to work together and you want to do 4 songs and say we're recording in 3 months' time, I'll say write as much material as possible, even up until the day beforehand. Having that whole back catalogue of stuff that you can kind of go, oh yeah, let's pick and choose like that, rather than just the first 4 songs you think of. Case in point, I'll give them a shout out. Urban Architects, a band I've already mentioned. Their first single is the last song they wrote the day before they hit the studio. And they wrote like 25 songs before heading in. And just on the day before, they sent me a home recording thing of just like, oh yeah, this is a last minute idea. And I just went, that's the single. That's one of the best demos I've ever been sent. So yeah, having the gear allows you to have that control of how many songs you write, and allows you to kind of pick and choose the best ones rather than just the first ones that come to mind.
And it's also, I guess, a bit of or humbleness on the part of a band to realise that not everything they write is necessarily worth releasing. And that's something some bands will find it hard to hear, but it is true.
Yeah, I think there's a maturity in that approach when you realise, you go, okay, if I write 100 songs, one of them might be incredible and 99 of them might be a bit meh. But I mean, that's how professional songwriters do it. They'll write, 5 to 6 songs a day for a month, and maybe one of those songs might get picked up, but that one song could be a number 1 hit. And that's how they operate. So the idea that like you'll just have whatever brainwave comes first will be the number 1 hit, statistically, that's very, very unlikely.
And I can guarantee that your favourite band, literally whoever they are, have loads and loads and loads and loads and loads of songs that they have written, maybe even recorded, and never released because they went, this is not good enough. One of the reasons why they're your favourite artists, and they seem to write every single song of theirs seems to be amazing, is because you don't hear the dross. You don't hear the stuff that they didn't like, putting it bluntly. Yeah.
I won't name names, but I have worked on a project with a stadium or arena band. So, they're a big band, worldwide tours. And I would say, as a person who's seen behind the curtain a little bit, they maybe would write 100 songs and 9 of them would make the album.
I've heard that kind of thing as well.
Yeah. So, and, it would be penalty upon death if any of those other songs ever got out. But that's just the normal process for a lot of bands.
That's tantalising to some. And again, like we said in the demo recording episode, these are all kinds of things where in years and years to come, if you've got a home recording of a song you don't like, it may happen to be that in years and years time you listen back to it and go, it's not as bad as we thought. And if you've got something like Kickstarter, it could be something that you put out as a bonus. So these things are never necessarily always useless. And in a similar token, you can cannibalize bits of these songs. So there may be a riff or a chorus that you really like that you've now got recorded that you could put into a different song.
Agree. I'm trying to think. I think Coldplay did that with one of the... I can't remember what song it is. I can sing it, but I'm not going to embarrass myself. But I know for a fact that they accidentally imported a guitar loop from another song into this one, and it just happened to fit, and they were like, oh, okay, cool. So it's a really good example of cannibalizing songs that didn't quite make it and putting them in songs that did.
I think it's him for that week, for him for the weekend, according to Google.
Okay, I'll trust you.
Have a look later.
Okay. The other thing, just playing devil's advocate, is there is a downside to having all this time, and that is almost option paralysis.
Ah, yes.
I think it's really, really difficult, and I've been very guilty of this as well, is if you're not working to a deadline, then you can edit and re-record and rework songs and rearrange songs for literally years and never release anything.
And it never ends.
So that is the one thing to consider. And it's maybe easier if you're in a band, because there's pressure. And when I say pressure, I mean kind of people who are going to set deadlines of people around you because they're excited about it, to kind of go, oh no, come on, let's release it. And you kind of can put things to vote. Whereas if you're by yourself and you're the only person doing quality surveillance, so to speak, then it's really difficult to kind of go, oh, okay, well, I think this is good enough, or I can do it better, or whatever. Option paralysis is a big danger of having a home recording setup.
And you can the other danger that immediately comes to mind in a similar way is you can add too much to the song. It's very possible. So there is a band called Winter Sun, who, if you're into any sort of tech or prog metal, you may have heard of. And it famously took them 7 years to release an album that they were recording themselves, because how do I put this? They didn't know when to stop. They had to get several new computers just to make the amount of tracks and the amount of things they were doing and orchestras and all sorts of things work. Now, at the time when they released that, I thought it was amazing. Listening back, I actually think it's a bit bloated and there's too much going on. And I think you've actually got to be very careful about adding too much to the song, because you can get to the point where there's just nothing to focus on because there's too much happening at the same time.
It's why an outside ear, I think, is important, no matter whether you're...
Very true.
The same applies for if you're going into a commercial studio or if you're doing home recording and have your own setup. Having someone like a mix engineer to come along and just go, pump the brakes, just try this, that, or having someone to bounce ideas off who has experience of finishing, essentially what a mix engineer does, finishing hundreds of songs. So case in point, I'll keep them anonymous again, is that band that I was working with, the single turned out great, but they sent me the session and they were like, oh, we just don't know. And it had I think it was something like 40 backing vocals and about 20 guitars. And they were like, we really like the chorus hook, but we're just not sure why it doesn't fit together. I muted 90% of the stems, and then I just sent them it back and they were like, oh, it's great. Yeah, that's what we're after. And that was their original version. Yes. But because they were home recording, they just kind of like, oh, okay, this doesn't work. And because it wasn't mixed, they weren't getting the feeling back from it that they wanted. And it was a case of going, oh, okay, well, let's add a guitar. We need to add a synth. More vocals, more vocals, more vocals, more vocals. So it's having that outside experience of someone who knows and has seen it all before and can just go, no, take this out, maybe try adding this, move this around here. And having that outside experience is something that's really, really useful if you're home recording.
Part of... I mean, a mixing engineer does many, many things, but part of their role, and a really important part, is bringing focus to the song. So it's like Joe said, part of the mixing engineer's job is to know when to mute stuff and when to unmute stuff. So if you send one of your songs to me or Joe or something like that, don't be offended if we mute some bits. It's because we are trying to serve the song. We are trying to make the best song possible. And it may be that amazing guitar part that you loved maybe wasn't the most helpful thing to the song. And, you know, don't get me wrong, we're not difficult. We're not going to just say blanket no if you really want it. But I think you've got to be, if you send stuff to a mixing engineer, you've got to be prepared for them to try things.
Yeah. Like you said, it's not a case of it will be a dictatorship and we'll go, this is the best way for it, whatever. Because at the end of the day, it's the artist's song. But there's an element of
yes,
you choose a mix engineer because of their ear and their experience and the way that they mix. So I'll do things different to the way Phil will do them. There's a reason why
100%.
you'd maybe hire. There might be something you hear in Phil's mixes that you go, okay, cool, that's the way Phil mixes it. Or it might be something that I do in mixes and you go, oh, okay, cool, that's the way Joe mixes it. I'd quite like that style for my song. And those stylistic choices come about because me and Phil have not so much taken risks, but have applied our artistic ear and, you know, our experience and gone, okay, we just might want to tweak this other thing and change another thing. Like there's loads of examples where I've done stuff and half the time I'll get an email back going, yeah, I love the mix, but that, you know, that a slightly out there different effect, like it could be a delay or a distortion on the solo, I'm not keen on that. Can we go back to like plan A? And then the other 50% of the time, they'll go, oh, yeah, that's the bit of the song. That's the thing that will sell it. It's our favourite part. And if we don't take those risks as mix engineers, then, you know, you never allow the opportunity for those situations to arise.
Joe, without naming names or anything like that, have you ever sneaked something into a mix and no one's noticed? Not like adding a part, but adding an effect or something like that.
I've definitely done stuff that I've felt in the moment that I've kind of gone, you know, it makes me sound like one of those artistic, annoying people. But when I'm mixing, I'm very much chasing a feeling. So I kind of want to, you know, there'll be references that will make me feel a certain way, whether it's like if it's an aggressive song, I kind of want it to sound energetic. And as I'm listening to it, I feel that energy. So sometimes when I get into a mixing thing, it might not be a specific reference. And I mean, this often goes as well for some artists I work with. Just give me the stems and they go, we've hired you because we like your mixes. Do whatever comes into your mind. And that's a perfectly reasonable standpoint. So there are times where I've just kind of gone wild and weird effects have been added. And majority of the time, the band really loves it. If they've given me free ride to be artistic with it, then I've done exactly what they've asked for. What about you?
I have sneaken. Snook. That's the word I can English. I've done a few things, sneaky things. It's no, you know, I'm never trying to sabotage the song. Don't hear me wrong. I'm not like let's sneak in a Moog part into this. I don't know, ambient track. I don't really do ambient music. I don't really know why I said that. Anyway, so I mean, what I did recently was there was a really kind of spaced out guitar part, and I just threw a phaser on it. And it sounded really cool. But the band just never mentioned it again. I think they liked it. I don't know if they noticed. It was really subtle.
Yeah. I don't know whether there's an element to that of that's almost what they were expecting from a mix engineer. Like, just, you know...
That's true.
We want that extra thing that we wouldn't think of. Otherwise, why would you hire a mix engineer to a certain extent?
Yeah.
You're doing things that a band can't do. That's the reason why you've been brought on. So if they wanted it that way, they'd do it. If that makes sense.
That's very true.
We've got into a very, very deep rabbit hole about ethics of mix engineering now.
That too. Anyway, I guess the major point is if you are recording yourself and you've written these songs yourself, having an outside ear is really, really, really super helpful. It gives you a chance for someone else to kind of come in and go, that's amazing, I really like that, or have you thought about this, that kind of thing. And to be honest, a really great person to bring in is a mixing engineer, because they get their hands on the track and they get to really have, I guess, a meaningful impact for the better, hopefully, and get their you get their input into it as well.
Yeah, I would say with 100% certainty that all the projects that I've worked on that I've been really, really proud of. I mean, it's safe to say that I'm proud of everything that I work on, but everything that I think has turned out the best have all been projects that I've been involved at, even from quite an early stage. And I don't necessarily mean like I was hands-on with the tracking or production. Even if there were mixes that did really well, there were ones where, they sent me a demo 3 months beforehand, and then they were kind of asking me about like ideas and stuff like that. So the earlier you can get an outside experienced ear on a project, the better it is.
Exactly.
And again, I think that's linking back to today's topic. Having a home recording studio allows you to have that back and forth with a mixing engineer. If you were going into a commercial studio and you had 2 days, you can't, in theory, you could, record the drums, send them a stem of the drums and ask what the mix engineer's opinion on it is. But that would rely on them being free at the same time that you're doing it. You'd have to then wait for a reply before you moved on to something. It's just not practical. Whereas if you were doing home recording, you record the drums, they could send you the drums, ask for your opinion on it. Do you think, as a mix engineer, is that something you could work with? Blah, blah, blah. Is there something we could be improving? Great. Move on to the bass. You can ask mix engineer for his opinion. What does he think on the X, Y, Z? Having that power to kind of set your own timetable allows you to bring in mix engineers, producers, or whatever, and kind of have that conversation that you won't be afforded and literally be able to afford in a commercial studio. Having
a conversation is a really good point. It's bouncing ideas backwards and forwards for the betterment, what's my word of the day, of your music.
Okay, so should we talk about, I feel like we've covered some of them, but some of the potential drawbacks of having a home recording setup. So I feel like the obvious one, and I mean, there are people who are going to be listening to this going, yeah, Joe and Phil, this sounds great, but I don't know how to plug a microphone in. Like, I've got all these ideas, and I'm not sure how to do it. One thing I'd say to you, and again, it always feels like I'm going to go back to the same thing, is if you bring in a mix engineer, we'll be the best people to help guide you through these things. Like I've said before, if you don't have a clue how to record drums, email me. I'll send you a really good drum guide on how to record drums. Really easy to follow PDF with pictures and instructions that you can apply to with whatever microphone and gear that you've got. But like I said, if you aren't sure, bringing in that experienced person who's been through it before is really, really useful.
Yes. I guess the potential drawback is you sort of sit there struggling by yourself and you don't know, you've bought this digital audio workstation on your laptop and you don't know how it works, and how do I get some audio into my computer at all. I would strongly recommend speaking to people like me and Joe, but in a sort of pinch, YouTube is your friend. There are tons and tons and tons, I mean literally tons, of guides about every single DAW under the sun, and how to use them and how to get audio onto a track, and things like that. And that is a great sort of starting point as well.
Yeah, there's almost a sense of creative freedom that comes with learning the skill of recording and putting your own ideas down, because the better you are at it, the better you can translate those ideas in your head that may not be, exactly like an acoustic and vocal thing. If they have got slightly more intricate production, it don't need to be the final thing, but it's a lot easier if you can kind of show a mix engineer or a producer or the rest of your bandmates even, you kind of go, these are my ideas and I've kind of made this production. And if you get quicker at working DAWs and just general recording skills, there'll be a quicker flow from your head to the speakers, if that makes sense. There's nothing less inspiring than having an idea in your head than going, right, how do I make an audio track? You'll stop writing instantly. It will disrupt all your flow. Whereas if you have those skills, it will improve your writing tenfold, because it will just feel like you're writing your idea down on a piece of paper, but you're actually creating it, and your ideas will come to life. if that makes sense.
It makes sense to me. So I hope it makes sense to everybody else. There, that was encouraging, wasn't it? Another.
Yeah, I feel like that should be the slogan for the podcast.
There it is. Another potential drawback is space, which is not actually something we talked about until now. In some countries, like America, most people, it seems to me, living in the UK, have a lot of space in their house. And there's a lot of room to record drums and things like this and all that. But certainly in Britain, where we live, houses are a lot smaller, and certainly flats are a lot smaller. And in some cases, you know, you kind of look around and go, well, where do I record? What kind of room is there for this? And you know, you can turn your living room into a recording space if you need to. But as we said before, you can always hire out a rehearsal room or a kind of community hall or whatever it may be, and there is a space for you to record. There are always solutions to these problems.
Yeah, there are a few companies that I'm sure if you Googled them, that will literally let you kind of rent out shells. So it will kind of be like a computer with an interface in an isolated room. So, and they're a lot cheaper than going to a commercial studio. So those are always options if, you know, you need to get drums done. I'd always recommend like a hybrid approach. So maybe use somewhere like that, or a big space like Phil mentioned, maybe like a community hall if you want to go full guerrilla style. Find a school hall, like a church if it's quiet enough, and record your drums there. And then you can kind of do your bass at home to the DIs, find a reasonable time of day and let your neighbours know that you might be recording guitar for the afternoon or something like that. There are loads of options to it. And I know it's difficult to kind of get the motivation to do it, but there really aren't any excuses, especially after last week's episode where we've outlined all the gear that you'd need to do it.
Yes. Here's controversial. Here's a potential benefit as opposed to a drawback. It's a lot of fun. You just get to spend time with your bandmates if you're in a band and mess about and create music. And it, you know, running your own home studio is a sort of ultimate in creative freedom, I think you said earlier. You get the space and the time to go, I wonder what this guitar sounds like if I put this weird pedal that I've got on it. I wonder what the bass sounds like with this weird pedal on it. I wonder what happens if I run my drums through this weird pedal. That kind of thing. And you can go, you know, what happens if you put a piece of paper in between the strings on a guitar, if you use a coin instead of a pick. All these kinds of weird and wonderful things, you can just try them and see what happens, and you might discover something amazing.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's something, I don't know whether it's a personal thing, but there's something quite attractive about albums that were made in different styles. Like, I know people like reading about and I could reference it so much in this episode, like the golden age or whatever, or the heyday of record making in big commercial studios. But there's something I quite like of really liking a record than finding out, you know, the drums were done in someone's shed and then the bass was done on the back of a tour van on a laptop and stuff like that. Those are the really interesting stories that when you do interviews and you start publicizing the song, that people will find interesting.
Yeah, I don't know why it took me this long to think about it, but Foo Fighters' album Wasting Light from about 2007, they recorded that entire thing in Dave Grohl's garage.
Yeah.
I remember, I've seen a lot about that, and that's, you know, I read a lot about that story because it's a lot of fun, and you listen to the album and go, that is recorded in a garage, it's not recorded in a studio.
There was a slight caveat of they spent an absolute fortune on the gear there.
They did.
It would not fit into our budget from last week.
But they did it in a compromised acoustic space.
Agreed.
So that's, I would argue the room is more important than the gear, and I would, and that you know, when you listen to the album, you can listen to it with that in mind. It's really cool.
So finally, I think it's good to just kind of summarize, and the question we've got written down here on our podcast plan is, should it be done? And for me, it feels like the obvious answer, and I'm sure Phil will agree with me, is yes. Like the there is obviously a place for commercial studios. We're not turning around and saying you should never record in a commercial studio, because I'd be a liar, because I love working with bands in commercial studios. They're great. I won't discount that. But if you don't have the budget, then it's a perfectly reasonable way of getting a professional sounding product if you go about it the right way.
Yes. It's a lot of fun. It's potentially freeing. And if you have recorded in the studio before, it's something different to try, and it may give your album an entirely different feel.
Exactly.
So on the subject of mixing engineers, if you want to contact me or Joe, then we can be found variously at joe@nevisaudio.com. I think that's right, isn't it? And Phil at vorticesoundstudios.com. We will happily listen to demos. We will happily listen to test recordings and things like that, and generally chat about music. We love chatting about music and recordings, so help us nerd out by contacting us. You can also contact the podcast at musicsurvivalguide@gmail.com, or go to our Facebook page, which is the Music Survival Guide Podcast.
Yeah, I also want to add as well, we keep on talking about we'll happily listen to demos, happily do this. If you've got a project ready to mix as well, we'll work on them. Like, I feel that's the one thing we miss out.
Also that.
So until next time, it's goodbye from me.
Goodbye from him.
We need to stop with these two bodies.